The heavy metal door slammed shut with a sound that echoed through the concrete hallways. Inside Riverside Maximum Security Prison, that sound meant one thing: someone new had arrived. And in Cell Block D, that meant Victor Kane would soon know about it. Victor had been at Riverside for 8 years, and in that time, he'd built something that most people on the outside would never understand. He hadn't just survived prison. He'd conquered it. At 37 years old, standing well over 6 feet tall with arms that looked like they could bend steel bars, Victor was the man everyone feared. Even the guards treated him differently, like a sleeping bear that you didn't want to wake up. He hadn't always been this way. There was a time many years ago when he was just another scared kid trying to survive on the streets. But prison had a way of changing people, and Victor had changed himself into something nobody would ever push around again. He'd learned early that in a place like this you were either the hammer or the nail, and Victor had decided he would always be the hammer. Every morning started the same way. Victor would wake up before the wake-up call, do his push-ups and sit-ups in his cell, and by the time the guards came around, he was already dressed and ready. He moved through the prison like he owned it, because in many ways he did. The other inmates made space for him when he walked by. Nobody sat at his table in the cafeteria unless he invited them. Nobody used his favorite weight bench in the yard. It wasn't just his size that made people afraid. Victor had a reputation. He'd been locked up for serious crimes, the kind that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable. And in his 8 years inside, he'd only added to that reputation. There were stories about what happened to people who crossed him. Stories whispered in cells at night. Some were true, some were probably exaggerated, but Victor never corrected them. Fear was useful, and he'd learned to use it like a tool. He controlled everything that mattered in Cell Block D. If someone wanted to get something from the outside, they came to Victor. If someone had a problem with another inmate, they came to Victor. If someone wanted protection, they definitely came to Victor. But protection wasn't free, and Victor always collected what he was owed. He'd built a whole system, a network of favors and debts that kept him on top. The guards knew about it, of course. They weren't stupid. But Victor was smart enough not to cause too much trouble. He kept things organized, almost businesslike. In a weird way, he made their jobs easier by keeping the other inmates in line, so they looked the other way, as long as he didn't push things too far. It was an understanding, unspoken but clear. In the prison yard, Victor held court like some kind of king. He'd sit on the bleachers with a few of his closest associates, watching everything that happened below. He knew which guards could be talked to, and which ones were by the book. He knew which inmates could be trusted and which ones were snitches. He knew everything because information was power, and Victor collected power the way other people collected stamps. Most days in prison were the same, boring and repetitive. But Victor had figured out how to make the time pass. He worked out constantly, keeping his body strong and intimidating. He read sometimes, mostly books about strategy and power, and he ran his operations, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always making sure nobody could challenge his position. There had been challenges over the years, of course. New inmates would come in, tough guys from the streets who thought they could make a name for themselves. They'd hear about Victor and decide they wanted to be the one to take him down. It never ended well for them. Victor had a way of handling problems that sent a clear message to everyone else. Don't even think about it. The prison chaplain had tried to reach him once, about 5 years back. A well-meaning older man who talked about redemption and second chances. Victor had listened for about 30 seconds before laughing in his face. "You think you can save me?" he'd said. "I don't need saving. I'm doing just fine." The chaplain never approached him again. Victor didn't think much about his past anymore. He'd learned that looking backward was pointless. His childhood, his family, the choices that led him here. What did any of it matter now? This was his life, and he'd made the best of it. He'd turned himself into someone who couldn't be hurt, couldn't be touched, couldn't be broken. The scared kid he used to be was dead and buried. The other inmates sometimes talked about getting out, about what they'd do when their sentences were up. Victor never joined those conversations. He had another 12 years on his sentence, and honestly, he wasn't sure what he'd do on the outside anymore. Prison had become his world, and he'd become very good at living in it. Out there, he'd just be another ex-con struggling to find work. In here, he was somebody. The library was one of his favorite spots, not because he loved reading, but because it was quiet and private. He could conduct his business there without too much attention. The old librarian didn't bother him, just let him use one of the back tables. It was perfect for meetings, for making deals, for keeping his finger on the pulse of everything happening in Cell Block D one afternoon. Sitting in his usual spot, Victor heard the warden talking to some guards near the entrance. Something about a new program, volunteers coming in to work with inmates. He rolled his eyes. Every few years, some do-gooders would show up with big ideas about rehabilitation and reform. They'd last a few months, maybe a year, before reality set in and they realized that most guys in here were beyond help, or at least, that's what Victor believed. He didn't pay much attention to it. Programs came and went. They never affected him anyway. He wasn't interested in being reformed or rehabilitated. He'd found his place in the world, even if that world was surrounded by concrete walls and razor wire. As he sat there that day, Victor had no idea that his entire world was about to change. He had no idea that someone was coming who would challenge everything he'd built, everything he believed about himself. He had no idea that the toughest prisoner in Riverside was about to meet his match. And it would come from a direction he never saw coming. It was a Tuesday morning when she arrived. Victor was in the yard doing his usual routine when he noticed the guards talking more than normal near the main entrance. Word traveled fast in prison, and by lunchtime everyone knew that the new volunteer program was starting. Some older woman was going to be running workshops or classes or something. Most of the inmates didn't care. Victor certainly didn't. Her name was Sister Helen, and she'd been doing this kind of work for 40 years. She'd worked in some of the roughest neighborhoods in Detroit, running community centers and youth programs in areas where most people were afraid to walk. She'd seen gang violence, poverty, addiction, and every kind of human struggle you could imagine. At 68 years old, she was barely 5 feet tall, with gray hair and glasses that made her look like someone's grandmother, which actually she was. The warden had warned her about Victor Kane. "He's the one you need to watch out for," he'd said during her orientation. "He runs Cell Block D like it's his personal kingdom. The man is dangerous, Sister Helen. I'm not trying to scare you, but you should know what you're dealing with." The other guards had nodded in agreement, sharing stories about Victor's reputation, his intimidating presence, the way he controlled everything around him. Sister Helen had listened politely and thanked them for the warning. But inside she wasn't afraid, not because she was naive or didn't believe them, but because she'd met hundreds of men like Victor over her 4 decades of service. She knew that behind all that toughness and all that anger, there was usually a hurt person who'd learned to protect themselves the only way they knew how. She'd seen it too many times to be fooled by the tough guy act anymore. Her first week was spent setting up in the prison library, the same place where Victor conducted most of his business. She arranged books, set up tables for workshops, and introduced herself to inmates who wandered in. Some were curious, some were skeptical, and some just wanted a quiet place to sit. She welcomed them all with the same warm smile and gentle manner. Victor watched from a distance at first. He'd see her through the library windows, this tiny old woman moving chairs around and organizing books like she was setting up a classroom. It was almost funny, really. What did she think she was going to accomplish here? Did she really believe she could change anyone in this place? He'd seen volunteers come and go over the years, all of them full of hope and good intentions. None of them lasted long once they realized what they were dealing with. On Thursday afternoon, Victor walked into the library for one of his usual meetings. He had his normal spot at the back table, the one where he always sat. But when he got there, Sister Helen was sitting in his chair, surrounded by books and papers, completely absorbed in whatever she was working on. He stood there for a moment, waiting for her to notice him and move. She didn't look up. The other inmates in the library had gone silent, watching to see what would happen. Everyone knew that was Victor's table. Everyone knew you didn't sit there unless he told you to. "You're in my seat," Victor said, his voice low and threatening. He used his full height, towering over her, the same intimidation tactic that had worked on countless people before. Sister Helen looked up from her work, and for the first time, Victor saw her face clearly. She had kind eyes, the type that seemed to actually see you rather than just look at you. And she wasn't scared, not even a little bit. "Oh, hello," she said pleasantly, as if they were meeting at a coffee shop instead of a maximum security prison. "You must be Victor. I've heard about you. I'm Sister Helen. I'll be running some programs here in the library. I don't care who you are. Victor said, his voice harder now. That's my table, move. There's plenty of room, she replied calmly, not moving an inch. Why don't you sit here? We can share the space. I'm just organizing these reading materials for tomorrow's workshop. Victor couldn't believe what he was hearing. Nobody talked to him like this. Nobody refused him. The silence in the library was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other inmates were watching, waiting to see if Victor would explode, if this tiny old woman had just made the biggest mistake of her life. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the complete lack of fear in her eyes. Maybe it was the way she spoke to him like he was just a regular person, not some dangerous criminal. Maybe it was just surprise. Whatever it was, Victor found himself unable to respond the way he normally would. Instead, he just stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked out of the library without another word. Behind him, he could hear the other inmates letting out their breath, probably shocked that Sister Helen was still in one piece. Victor was shocked too, though he'd never admit it. In 8 years, nobody had stood up to him like that. Nobody had treated his intimidation like it was nothing. Over the next few days, Victor couldn't stop thinking about that encounter. It bothered him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He was used to people being afraid of him. He was used to having power, but Sister Helen had taken that power away without even trying, just by refusing to acknowledge it existed. It was like she was playing a completely different game, one where his usual rules didn't apply. He started watching her more carefully. She'd set up her workshops and a few inmates had started attending, mostly the weaker guys, the ones who weren't connected to anyone, who were trying to keep their heads down and do their time. Victor saw them gathering around her, listening as she talked about reading and writing, about telling their stories, about finding their voices. It was ridiculous, really. What good would writing do them in here? This wasn't school. This was prison. The only thing that mattered was strength and survival. Yet something about the way those men listened to her, the way they seemed to relax around her, irritated Victor more than it should have. On the following Tuesday, Victor decided to send her a message. He walked into the library during one of her workshops and sat down right in the middle of the circle, uninvited. The other inmates immediately went quiet, nervous about what he was doing there. Sister Helen just smiled at him. "Victor, welcome," she said. "We're discussing personal narratives today. Everyone's sharing a memory from before they came here. Would you like to participate?" "I'm not here to share anything," Victor said, crossing his arms. "I'm just watching, making sure everything stays safe in here." "Of course," Sister Helen replied, not missing a beat. "You're welcome to stay. But if you're going to be here, I'd appreciate it if you didn't interrupt. These men are being brave by opening up and they deserve respect." Victor almost laughed. She was telling him how to behave? In his prison? But again, that same strange thing happened. Instead of getting angry, instead of putting her in her place, he found himself just sitting there quietly. And for the next hour, he listened as inmates shared stories about their childhoods, their families, their regrets. Some of it was weak, emotional stuff that normally would have made him sick. But sitting there, listening to Sister Helen respond to each person with genuine care and attention, something started to shift inside him, something he didn't understand and definitely didn't like. When the workshop ended and the other inmates filed out, Victor remained seated. Sister Helen started gathering her materials, acting like he wasn't even there. Finally, he spoke. "What do you want?" he asked. "Why are you really here?" Sister Helen stopped what she was doing and looked directly at him. "I'm here because I believe every person has value, Victor. Even in a place like this. Even people that society has given up on. You think you can fix us?" Victor said with a bitter laugh. "You think your little workshops are going to change anything?" "I'm not here to fix anyone," she said simply. "I'm here to remind people who they are underneath everything else. Underneath the mistakes and the anger and the walls they've built around themselves." Victor stood up, ready to leave. But before he walked away, he turned back. "You don't know anything about me." Sister Helen met his eyes with that same calm, steady gaze. "I know you're afraid, Victor. I know you've built something here that makes you feel powerful and safe. And I know that underneath all of that, there's a person you've forgotten how to be." The words hit Victor like a physical blow. He wanted to say something cruel, something that would hurt her the way her words had hurt him. But nothing came out. He just walked away, angry and confused and feeling things he'd spent years trying not to feel. As he left the library, Victor realized something that scared him more than anything had in a long time. Sister Helen wasn't afraid of him, and that meant she might actually be dangerous in a way he'd never encountered before. Victor couldn't sleep that night. Sister Helen's words kept playing in his head like a song he couldn't turn off. "You're afraid." Nobody had ever said that to him before. Or at least, nobody had ever been brave enough to say it to his face. He lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, angry at himself for even caring what some old woman thought about him. The next morning he was in a foul mood. The other inmates could sense it and gave him even more space than usual. But Victor's mind wasn't on prison business. He kept thinking about Sister Helen, about how she'd looked at him with those knowing eyes like she could see right through all the walls he'd built. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Over the following weeks, Victor found himself in a strange battle with Sister Helen. It wasn't physical, nothing he could actually fight. It was something else, something that made him feel off balance in a way he'd never experienced before. He started showing up at her workshops, always uninvited, always claiming he was just keeping an eye on things. But really, he was trying to prove something. He'd sit there and make quiet comments designed to undermine her, to show the other inmates that she was wasting their time. When someone shared a story about missing their family, Victor would mutter something about weakness. When Sister Helen talked about forgiveness and second chances, he'd laugh under his breath. He was trying to break her spirit, to make her quit like all the other volunteers before her. But Sister Helen never took the bait. She'd acknowledge his presence with a polite nod and continue with her work, treating his disruptions like they were nothing more than background noise. It was driving him crazy. Every tactic he'd ever used to control people seemed useless against her. She didn't respond to intimidation. She didn't get angry or scared. She just kept showing up day after day with that same calm presence and gentle smile. And slowly, Victor noticed something that made him even angrier. The inmates were responding to her. Men who'd been hard and closed off were starting to open up in her workshops. They were writing, sharing, even crying sometimes. And they seemed lighter somehow, like Sister Helen was giving them something Victor couldn't understand. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after she'd arrived, Victor decided to confront her directly. He waited until her workshop was over and the other inmates had left. Sister Helen was putting away books when he approached her. "You're wasting your time here," he said, leaning against a bookshelf. "These men aren't going to change. They're criminals. They belong in cages." Sister Helen looked up at him thoughtfully. "Is that what you believe about yourself too, Victor?" "I'm not talking about me," he shot back. "I'm talking about reality. You come in here with your books and your kind words thinking you're making a difference. But the moment these guys get out, they'll go right back to what they were doing before. People don't change." "Some people don't," Sister Helen agreed, surprising him. "But that's usually because they're too afraid to try. Change is scary, Victor. It's much easier to stay the same even when staying the same is making us miserable." "I'm not miserable," Victor said, his voice hard. "I run this place. I've got everything under control." Sister Helen set down the book she was holding and walked closer to him. Even though she barely came up to his chest, somehow she didn't seem small. "Control is just another prison, Victor. You're serving a sentence. But you've built another one inside your own heart, and that one has no release date." Victor felt his anger rising, the familiar heat that usually preceded violence. But something held him back. Maybe it was the fact that she was an old woman. Maybe it was something else. "You don't know anything about my heart," he said quietly. "I know that hurt people," Sister Helen replied. "I know that behind all this anger and all this power you've claimed, there's someone who's been in pain for a very long time. And I know that you're exhausted from carrying it all by yourself." Her words cut deeper than any insult could have. Victor wanted to walk away, to dismiss her like he dismissed everyone else. But his feet wouldn't move. For just a moment his carefully constructed mask slipped, and something raw and vulnerable showed through. "Why do you care?" he asked, and his voice came out softer than he intended. "I'm exactly what everyone says I am. I've hurt people. I've done terrible things. Why would someone like you waste time on someone like me?" Sister Helen's expression softened even more. "Because I don't believe anyone is beyond hope, Victor. Not you, not anyone. I've spent 40 years working with people the world had given up on. And I've seen too many miracles to stop believing in them now." Victor shook his head. "There's no miracle here. This is who I am. "This is who you've chosen to become," Sister Helen corrected gently. "But it's not who you have to stay. Every day is a new choice, Victor. Every single day." Before he could respond, an alarm started blaring. It was the signal for inmates to return to their cells, an early lockdown. Victor stepped back, the moment broken. As he turned to leave, Sister Helen called after him. "Victor, I run an additional session on Thursday evenings. Just writing, nothing formal. You should come. Not to watch or intimidate. Just to try." He didn't answer, just kept walking. But her invitation echoed in his mind for the rest of the day and into the night. Thursday came and Victor told himself he wasn't going to that session. It was beneath him. He had a reputation to maintain. But as the evening approached, he found himself thinking about it more and more. What would he even write about? He hadn't written anything personal since he was a kid in school, and even then it had just been assignments he had to complete. 8 o'clock came and went. Victor sat in his cell, arms crossed, determined not to go. But at 8:15 he found himself walking down the corridor toward the library. He told himself he was just going to check on things, make sure everything was secure. Nothing more than that. When he entered the library, only 3 other inmates were there, sitting around a table with Sister Helen. She looked up and smiled at him, but didn't make a big deal of his arrival. She just gestured to an empty chair and slid a notebook and pen across the table. "We're writing about a moment that changed us," she said simply. "It can be good or bad, big or small. Just something that made you different than you were before." Victor sat down slowly, feeling ridiculous. The other inmates glanced at him nervously, probably wondering if he was there to cause trouble. He picked up the pen, surprised at how strange it felt in his hand. How long had it been since he'd written anything besides signing his name on prison forms? For 10 minutes he just sat there, pen hovering over the blank page. The other inmates were writing, their pens scratching quietly against paper. Sister Helen was writing too, giving them space to work. Victor's mind was racing, flooded with memories he'd spent years trying to forget. His childhood, his first arrest, the moment he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. The day he decided that being feared was better than being hurt. Without really deciding to, Victor started writing. The words came slowly at first, then faster. He wrote about being 12 years old, about his father's fists, about learning that the world was divided into people who had power and people who didn't. He wrote about making a choice to never be powerless again, no matter what it cost. His handwriting was messy, his spelling probably terrible, but the words kept coming. When Sister Helen called time, Victor looked down at his page in surprise. He'd filled almost 3 full pages. His hand was cramping from gripping the pen so hard. "Would anyone like to share?" Sister Helen asked. The other inmates read their pieces, voices shaking with emotion. Victor listened, surprised by their honesty, by their willingness to be vulnerable. When they finished, Sister Helen looked at him. "Victor, would you like to share?" Every instinct told him to say no, to crumple up the paper and walk out. But something else, something he barely recognized, made him want to read what he'd written. Not for Sister Helen or the other inmates. For himself. Just to hear the words out loud, to let them exist outside his own head. "No," he said finally, closing the notebook. "Not today." Sister Helen nodded, no judgment in her expression. "That's fine. Just writing it down is enough for now. You can keep the notebook if you'd like." Victor took the notebook back to his cell. That night he read what he'd written again. And for the first time in 8 years, for the first time since he'd become the man everyone feared, Victor felt something crack inside the armor he'd built around himself. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, and it terrified him more than anything ever had. Victor kept writing in that notebook. At first it was just late at night when his cellmate was asleep and nobody could see him. He'd write about memories he'd locked away, feelings he'd convinced himself he didn't have anymore. Sometimes the words made him angry. Sometimes they made him sad. But he couldn't stop. It was like Sister Helen had opened a door inside him that he couldn't close again. He still ran Cell Block D. He still collected his debts and maintained his reputation. But something was different now. The other inmates noticed it, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what had changed. Victor was still intimidating, still powerful, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something almost human. He started going to Sister Helen's workshops regularly. Not every time, but often enough that people stopped being surprised to see him there. He never shared what he wrote, but he listened when others did. And slowly, very slowly, the hard shell he'd built around himself started to develop more cracks. Then came the day that changed everything. It started in the cafeteria during lunch. A young inmate named Tommy, barely 20 years old, had been at Riverside for only 3 months. He was small, scared, and exactly the type that predators looked for. Tommy had started attending Sister Helen's workshops, finding some comfort in the safe space she created. But outside that library, he was still vulnerable. An older inmate named Raymond had been pressuring Tommy for weeks, demanding money from his commissary account, threatening him if he didn't pay. Tommy had nobody to protect him. He'd kept quiet about it, too afraid to tell anyone. But on this particular day, Raymond's patience had run out. Victor was sitting at his usual table when he heard the commotion. Raymond had cornered Tommy near the food line, speaking to him in low, threatening tones. Other inmates were watching, but nobody was stepping in. That was prison. You minded your own business unless you wanted to become a target yourself. Victor watched for a moment, prepared to ignore it like he always did. What happened to weak inmates wasn't his problem unless it affected his business. But then he saw Tommy's face, saw the pure terror in the kid's eyes, and something unexpected happened. He remembered sitting in Sister Helen's workshop, listening to Tommy read a piece about missing his little sister, about wanting to be better when he got out. He remembered the kid's voice shaking as he talked about his mistakes and his hopes. Before Victor fully realized what he was doing, he stood up and walked over to Raymond. "Leave him alone," Victor said. His voice quiet but carrying that tone everyone in the prison knew meant business. Raymond looked up in surprise. "This doesn't concern you, Victor." "The kid owes me." "Not anymore," Victor replied. "Whatever he owed you, consider it paid. Now walk away." Raymond's face went red with anger, but he wasn't stupid enough to challenge Victor directly. He backed off, shooting Tommy one last threatening look before returning to his own table. Tommy stood there trembling, looking at Victor with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Thank you," Tommy whispered. Victor just nodded and walked back to his table, but inside his mind was racing. Why had he done that? He'd just broken one of his own rules. Never get involved unless there was something in it for him. Never show weakness by protecting someone weaker. But he couldn't have walked away. Something in him wouldn't let him. That afternoon, Sister Helen was setting up for her workshop when Victor entered the library early. She looked up, surprised to see him before the session started. "Can I talk to you?" Victor asked, and there was something uncertain in his voice that she'd never heard before. "Of course," Sister Helen said, setting down her materials. "What's on your mind?" Victor sat down heavily in one of the chairs. For a long moment he didn't speak, just stared at his hands. Finally the words came out. "Something happened today in the cafeteria. I helped someone, a kid who was being threatened. And I don't know why I did it." Sister Helen smiled gently. "Maybe you did it because it was the right thing to do." "I don't do the right thing," Victor said, frustration in his voice. "That's not who I am. I'm not the good guy. I'm the person other people are afraid of." "Were you always that person?" Sister Helen asked. Victor thought about it. He remembered being a kid before everything went wrong. He remembered having dreams once, normal dreams like other children had. He remembered his mother, before she left, telling him he had a good heart. When had that changed? When had he decided that being good meant being weak? "No," he admitted quietly. "I wasn't always like this." "Then maybe," Sister Helen said, "you're just remembering who you used to be, who you still are underneath everything else." "I've done terrible things," Victor said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've hurt people. I've been hurting people for years. You can't just come back from that." Sister Helen moved her chair closer to his. "Victor, I'm not going to tell you that your past doesn't matter. It does. The things you've done have consequences, and you're living with those consequences now. But that doesn't mean you can't be different going forward. That doesn't mean you can't start making different choices." "What if it's too late?" Victor asked, and there was real fear in his voice now. "What if I've been this person for so long that I can't be anything else?" "It's never too late," Sister Helen said firmly. "As long as you're breathing, as long as your heart is beating, you have the chance to choose differently. But Victor, you have to want it. Real change is hard. It's painful. It means letting go of the protection that anger and fear have given you." Victor felt something breaking inside him, something that had been holding together for years. "I'm tired," he said, and his voice cracked. "I'm so tired of being this person. I'm tired of being angry all the time. I'm tired of hurting people. I'm tired of everyone being afraid of me. I know you are, Sister Helen said softly. I can see it in your eyes. You're exhausted from carrying all this weight by yourself. And then, for the first time since he was a child, Victor started to cry. Not just a few tears, but deep, heavy sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside him that he'd forgotten it existed. Years of pain, years of anger, years of pretending to be something he wasn't, all came pouring out. Sister Helen didn't say anything, didn't try to stop him or comfort him with empty words. She just sat there, a quiet presence letting him release everything he'd been holding inside. When the tears finally stopped, Victor felt hollow, but somehow lighter. He wiped his face with his sleeve, embarrassed but also strangely relieved. I don't know how to be different, he said. This is all I know. Being tough, being in control. If I'm not that person, who am I? That's what you get to discover, Sister Helen said. And you don't have to figure it all out at once. Just start with today. Just start with the next choice you make. Victor nodded slowly. That kid, Tommy. Raymond's going to come after him again when I'm not around. So maybe you make sure Raymond knows that Tommy is under your protection now, Sister Helen suggested. Use the power you have for something good. It was such a simple idea, but it hit Victor like a revelation. He'd spent 8 years using his power to control people, to benefit himself. What would happen if he used it differently? What if he protected people instead of preying on them? Over the next few days, Victor did exactly that. He let it be known throughout Cell Block D that Tommy was not to be touched. He extended the same protection to a few other vulnerable inmates, the ones who'd been targets before. The other prisoners were confused by this change, but they didn't question it. Victor was still Victor and nobody wanted to challenge him, but the biggest change was inside Victor himself. He started participating more in Sister Helen's workshops, even sharing his writing once or twice. He helped Tommy learn to read better. He broke up conflicts instead of encouraging them. He still maintained order in Cell Block D, but now he did it with less violence, more fairness. The guards noticed too. The prison felt different somehow, calmer. They didn't understand what had changed, but they could see that something had. Sister Helen watched it all with quiet pride. She never made a big deal about Victor's transformation, never drew attention to it. She just encouraged him, gently guided him, and reminded him that every day was a new choice. One evening, after a workshop, Victor stayed behind again. Sister Helen, he said, I want you to know something. When you first came here, I thought you were just another naive volunteer who'd quit after a few months. I tried to make you leave. I know, Sister Helen said with a small smile. But you didn't leave. You saw something in me that I'd forgotten was there. You believed I could be better when I didn't believe it myself. Victor paused, struggling with the words. You saved my life. Not my physical life, but the life that actually matters. The person I could still be. Sister Helen reached out and patted his hand. No, Victor. I didn't save you. You saved yourself. I just reminded you that you were worth saving. Everything else, every choice to change, every moment of courage, that was all you. Victor felt tears threatening again. But this time, he didn't fight them. For the first time in his adult life, he felt something he thought he'd lost forever. He felt hope. 2 years passed and Riverside Prison was a different place. Or maybe it was just that Victor was a different person. He still had influence in Cell Block D, but he used it differently now. Instead of running a network of fear and debts, he'd become something unexpected. A mentor, a protector, someone that younger inmates came to for advice instead of protection money. Sister Helen's workshops had grown. More inmates attended now, and Victor was there almost every time. He'd even started leading some sessions himself, helping guys who struggled with reading and writing. The same hands that had once hurt people now turned pages gently, pointing out words and encouraging men who'd given up on themselves. Tommy had become like a younger brother to Victor. The scared kid who'd arrived 3 years ago had grown stronger, more confident. He'd gotten his high school equivalency diploma with Victor's help and was taking college courses through a correspondence program. Sometimes Victor would sit with him in the library, both of them working on their assignments, and it felt almost normal. Almost like they were just regular people studying together, not inmates in a maximum security prison. But life has a way of reminding you that nothing stays the same forever. It was a cold morning in November when Sister Helen didn't show up for her usual workshop. Victor waited in the library with a dozen other inmates, all of them checking the clock, wondering where she was. Sister Helen was never late. She was the most reliable person any of them had ever known. After 30 minutes, the prison chaplain came in. His face was serious, and Victor felt his stomach drop before the man even spoke. "I have some difficult news," the chaplain said. "Sister Helen is in the hospital. She had a heart attack last night. She's stable now, but the doctors say she needs to rest for a while. She won't be able to come back to the prison for some time." The room went silent. Victor felt like he'd been punched in the chest. Sister Helen had seemed fine just 2 days ago. She'd been laughing with them, encouraging them, being her usual strong self. "How could this happen? Is she going to be okay?" Tommy asked, his voice small. "The doctors are hopeful," the chaplain replied. "But she's 68 years old, and this was a serious event. She needs time to recover. I know this is hard for all of you. She means a lot to this program." After the chaplain left, the inmates sat in stunned silence. Some of them had tears in their eyes. Sister Helen had been more than just a volunteer to them. She'd been hope. She'd been proof that someone cared about them, that they were worth caring about. The thought of losing her was almost unbearable. Victor stood up abruptly and left the library. He walked to the yard, needing space to process what he was feeling. Anger, fear, sadness all mixed together in a way that made him want to hit something. But he didn't. He just stood there, hands gripping the chain-link fence, trying to breathe through the pain. That night he wrote in his notebook. He wrote about what Sister Helen meant to him, about how she'd changed his life, about the fear of losing the one person who'd believed in him. And as he wrote, he realized something important. Sister Helen had given him tools, shown him a different way to be. But the work of becoming better, of staying better, that was his responsibility now. She'd lit a candle inside him, and he couldn't let it go out just because she wasn't there to tend it. The next day, Victor gathered the regular workshop attendees in the library. About 15 men showed up, all of them looking lost without Sister Helen's guidance. "I know we're all worried about Sister Helen," Victor said, standing in front of them. "I am too. But you know what she'd want? She'd want us to keep going. She'd want us to keep working on ourselves, keep trying to be better. So that's what we're going to do." "But you're not a teacher," one of the inmates said. "How are we supposed to do this without her?" "We figure it out together," Victor replied. "We keep reading, keep writing, keep supporting each other. Sister Helen started something here, but it doesn't have to end just because she's not physically present. Everything she taught us, all the tools she gave us, we still have those." And so they continued. Victor led the workshops, though he felt completely unqualified. Other inmates helped too, the ones who'd been there longest. They read together, wrote together, talked about their struggles and their hopes. It wasn't the same without Sister Helen, but it was something. It was them choosing to keep growing even when it was hard. 3 weeks later, Victor got permission to call the hospital. His hands shook as he dialed the number, afraid of what he might hear. When Sister Helen's voice came on the line, weak but unmistakably her, Victor felt tears of relief spring to his eyes. "Sister Helen," he said. "It's Victor." "Victor," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "How are things at Riverside?" "We're managing," he told her. "We've been keeping the workshops going. It's not as good as when you're here, but we're trying." "That's wonderful," Sister Helen said, and she sounded genuinely happy. "Victor, I'm so proud of you. Not just for keeping the program going, but for everything you've become." "I wouldn't be this person without you," Victor said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, you would," Sister Helen replied firmly. "I just helped you remember who you already were. The courage, the compassion, the desire to be better that was always inside you. You did the hard work of bringing it out." They talked for a few more minutes before Sister Helen needed to rest. But that conversation stayed with Victor for days. She was right. He'd changed himself, and that meant he could stay changed, even without her there to guide him. The months that followed were hard. Sister Helen's recovery was slow, and it became clear that she wouldn't be returning to prison work. Her doctors had advised her to take it easy, to enjoy her retirement, to stop putting herself in stressful situations. It broke Victor's heart, but he understood. She'd given 40 years of her life to helping people like him. She deserved rest, but her legacy lived on. Victor continued running the workshops. He got his own GED, then started taking college courses himself. He became the person that new inmates came to when they were struggling, when they needed advice or protection. He broke up fights instead of starting them. He encouraged education instead of exploitation. The prison administration noticed the change. They made Victor an official peer counselor, gave him resources to expand the program. Cell Block D had become one of the calmest, most productive sections of Riverside. Violence was down. Participation in education programs was up. And it all traced back to one small woman who'd refused to be intimidated, who'd seen beyond Victor's tough exterior to the person underneath. On the 1-year anniversary of Sister Helen's heart attack, Victor organized something special. He gathered all the workshop participants, and together they wrote letters to Sister Helen, not asking her to come back, but thanking her for everything she'd given them. Telling her how they were doing, what they'd accomplished, how they were trying to be better men. Victor's letter was the longest. He wrote about his transformation, about the fact that he had 10 more years on his sentence but no longer felt like he was just surviving prison. He was living, learning, growing. He wrote about his plans for when he got out, about wanting to work with at-risk youth, to help kids before they made the mistakes he'd made. He wrote about hope, something he'd thought he'd lost forever until she came into his life. When the letters were all collected, Victor mailed them together in a large envelope. 3 weeks later, he got a response. Sister Helen had written back to each person individually, short notes of encouragement and pride. But to Victor, she'd written something more. Dear Victor, the letter read, I always knew you had greatness in you. Not the kind of greatness that comes from power or fear, but the kind that comes from courage and compassion. You've become the man I always believed you could be, and I'm honored to have been part of your journey. But remember, I didn't create your transformation, you did. And that means it's yours to keep, yours to build on, yours to share with others who need hope just like you once did. Keep being the light, Victor.
Keep showing others that change is possible.
Your story isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning. With love and pride, Sister Helen. Victor read that letter so many times that he memorized every word. He kept it in his cell, taking it out whenever he felt discouraged or tempted to fall back into old patterns. And whenever a new inmate arrived at Riverside, scared and angry and convinced they were beyond help, Victor would think of Sister Helen. He'd remember the tiny woman who'd refused to be intimidated by the toughest prisoner in Cell Block D, and he'd do for them what she'd done for him. He'd see them. Really see them. Not the crime, not the reputation, not the walls they'd built around themselves. He'd see the person underneath, the person who could still choose to be better. Because Victor had learned the most important lesson Sister Helen had to teach, that nobody is beyond redemption, that change is always possible, that the toughest battle isn't with the world around you, but with the person you see in the mirror, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone care about you, let them believe in you, even when you can't believe in yourself. The toughest prisoner had met his match, and in losing that battle, he'd won back his soul.